Oh boy. So I'm going to say right off the bat that this is going to be an individual book rant review. And I want to give myself ample time to talk about this respective book, even though part of me kind of dreads the experience of having to recount the events of this book because I wrote a very long rant review on my blog and also on Goodreads about this particular book that I feel like too many people kind of overlooked a lot of the issues that were in this respective book, and I kind of want to have the space to be able to talk about it on the channel and also be able to give it a review because it was a galley that I had requested on NetGalley because I have read this author before and I remember liking some of her work, but this one I think for a YA fantasy verse book that was this author's debut into YA fantasy, I think it dropped the ball pretty hard. So we'll talk about it. Hi everyone, my name is Rose, also known as TA Summers. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a review of Ibi Zoboi's Shin, which is a verse novel that is based on Caribbean lore, which follows the perspectives of two girls who are more similar than you think without going into too many spoilers to start with. This is the cover up for your reference. We're going to talk about this book because I had an intrigue in wanting to pick this book up because I love YA fantasy. This was pitched as a Caribbean inspired fantasy about monsters, about a very specific monster in terms of Caribbean culture, and essentially basically following the events that happen in this respective novel as told in verse, which is interesting to see a YA fantasy that is actually penned in the way of a verse novel in terms of being focused on the poetry and the structure and things like that. I'll also talk about the fact that this particular book also failed on the poetry part, but we'll get into that in this respective video. I don't want to spend too much time in this intro because there's a lot to talk about in this respective novel, but I will say that I am familiar with the author's work. Ibi Zoboi is also the author of American Street, which I have read before, and I actually gave it, I think, 4 stars, but it's been a long time since I've read it, and I think that was her debut. I also have read Pride, which is a Pride and Prejudice retelling, though I have not given a review of that book quite yet. And I'll put the covers of these books for your reference up here. But there's another book that I also have as a galley called Nigeria Jones, which I am planning on reading and reviewing for the channel as well. But I did request Shin specifically because I wanted to talk about this respective book because as someone who loves YA fantasy and mythological storytelling and things like that, I definitely wanted to pick up this respective book, and also I like the cover of it. But we'll talk about it. Without further ado, let's go and begin. So before I get into this review, let me just briefly read to you the description of the book, and that's essentially what drew me into this respective verse novel to begin with. So I'm just gonna go ahead and just read this out to you. From award-winning New York Times bestselling author Ibi Zoboi comes her groundbreaking contemporary fantasy debut, a novel in verse based on Caribbean folklore about the power of inherited magic and the price we must pay to live the life we yearn for. 15-year-old Morrison is the daughter of a Sokoya. Every new moon, she shed her skin, like the many women before her, shifting into a fireball witch who must fly in the night and slowly slip from the lives of others to sustain her own. But Brooklyn is no place for fireball witches with all of its bright lights, its shut windows, and bolt-locked doors, while Morrison hoped they would leave their old traditions behind when they immigrated from the islands. She knows that this will never happen while she remains ensnared by the one person who keeps her chained to her magical past, her mother. 17-year-old Genevieve is the daughter of a college professor and newly minted older half-sister of twins. Her worsening skin condition and the baby's constant wailing keep her up at night when she stares at the dark sky with a deep longing to inhale it all. She hopes to quench the hunger that gnaws at her, one that seems to reach for some memory of her estranged mother. When a new nanny arrives to help with the twins, a family secret connecting her to Marisol is revealed, and Jen begins to find answers to questions she hasn't even thought to ask. But the girls soon discover that the very skin keeping the flames locked beneath the surface may be more explosive to the relationships around them than any ancient magic. Okay, so that description sounds intriguing, right? Like, basically, like, you have a Caribbean-based folklore tale of the Sokoya. I'll put up the term for your reference. That this is the specific term that I'm referring to and how to pronounce it. I was trying to look it up since I read this in physical form, and I wanted to know more about the respective lore. The Sokoya is basically as described, but I'll get into where I feel like some of the terminology and the way that it was presented in this book kind of like is conflated a bit with the different lores that are in different islands across the Caribbean, and where this really just kind of mixes terms and things and presents it in a way that's not great as the book goes on. But it sounds intriguing, right? It sounds intriguing, but I'm going to get into the many problems that this book has, including very toxic forms of colorism, of self-hate, just a lot of trauma that really did not work in this respective book at all. But we'll get into that, so let's just go ahead and dive in. The other thing I'm going to mention is that I'm going to have a brief aside talking about how this book made me think of the lore and the representation of the character in a game that I have absolutely played. This is Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance, and we'll talk about the lore of that a little bit later in this video and how it relates to Scanned by Ibi Zoboi, and also the representation in terms of things. Though I do feel like the Sokoya and the Lugaro had representation across the Shin Megami Tensei series. I have not played all of the games in this respective series, but I want to say that, like, I actually saw the representation of a character that was very similar to the Sokoya in one of the previous games. If someone can correct me, tell me like what that character is, I would be very grateful to you, because I've been trying to find it and it's driving me bonkers in terms of trying to find the equivalent of the Sokoya. I did find the equivalent of the Lugaro as in Shin Megami Tensei 5 and Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance, and I'll talk about that later in this respective video. So I'm going to give a brief summation of what my overarching issues with Skin are in terms of things, so that you have a general idea of what I'm going to critique in this video, and this is essentially the way that I started off my review. I feel like, as an overarching narrative, in addition to the really odd way that the verse was done between these two characters, some parts of the verse in terms of how this narrative is written made sense in terms of made sense in terms of where line breaks were and where certain places broke off. But the cadence, like, that was one of the things that actually bothered me in the scope of this verse novel. I have not listened to the audiobook, so I don't know how the reader respectively like read this particular verse novel, but I knew that as someone who is very well versed in poetry, like poetry and readings, I've been reading poetry, writing poetry for years. This book did not make sense to me to be put in verse, because the cadence made it read longer than what it should in terms of the way that this story was told. You would think that a verse novel would go and flow very seamlessly, smoothly, like, and it wouldn't feel like it reads long. But to me, Skin was actually hindered a bit being in verse because it did feel longer than what the tale would allow. And then also the fact that it really did not give a lot of room for expansion in terms of being able to develop some of the world building in terms of things. And I think we'll get into how the world building was done in this novel in terms of things and how it was presented. But I think one of the problems right off the bat was to kind of summarize it. Choice to use verse made the novel feel longer than what it was, and it was uneven in terms of its presentations. That was one of the things that bothered me as I was reading the respective novel. The second thing that I'm going to say is that it cedes to a lot of harmful stereotypes, which, as I mentioned in the previous sections, that there's a lot of harmful colorism, representation of colorism, and as I get into some of the plot points of Skin, you'll know what that harmful representation of colorism is and how it relates in some of the references that make it very clear that there's a harmful element to this. It is inexplicable to me in terms of why this was done in a YA fantasy novel and presented as a piece where it felt like the narrative was playing this up as a thing to be desired. Other things about it to briefly mention: the Caribbean is not a monolith. There are different islands that have different terminologies, that have different celebrations and things like that, where in terms of unique to each of the islands in the Caribbean in terms of things. Haiti has their own thing. Grenada has their own thing. Trinidad and Tobago have their own. The way that Skin presents its lore and certain aspects of its lore feel like it is meshing together multiple cultural things. And that was something that I picked up on that kind of had it as a red flag to me when I saw it. To full disclosure, this is not my culture. I am not from Haiti. I am not from Grenada. I am not Trini. I recognize from people that I know, for people who have lived with the culture, who are familiar with the culture even more so than me, that there were things in this that did not work, that felt like it was a meshing of different cultures, kind of, and even buying into several stereotypes to present its respective story. So that was another aspect of this that really bothered me. Even if you take those respective major red flags there, I would also say that the presentation of the story overall did not develop past cursory representation, petty jealousies of the respective characters and motivations of certain characters, and it was very much lacking in character development. So those are the overarching issues that I'm going to talk about in this respective video, and we're just going to go ahead and dive in because there's a lot to dissect. So to start off with talking about where Skin by Ibi Zoboi starts, you're following 15-year-old Marisol and her mother, who are living in Brooklyn, and they have moved from the islands to Brooklyn to essentially be able to live, but they have a very big secret in terms of, you learn that Marisol and her mother are both Sokoya, which is also known as a hag, or also known as the Lugaro. How this respective tale starts: they are fire witches who fly during the night. They essentially shed their skins, place the skins in a motar, in terms of a body of water. You watch as they fly in the night to find their respective victims in terms of being able to feed off the life of them in terms of things. So that's a summation of the Sokoya in terms of how it's represented in the novel for reference. And both Marisol and her mother do this ritual in terms of being able to control their feeding in terms of things and find what victims that they have and that sort of thing. And you may have the understanding that there's a toxic relationship between Marisol and her mother, and having Marisol target certain victims in terms of things as they're living in secret and being able to sustain themselves. It becomes clear, like, there's a goal in all of this in terms of why Marisol's mother brings her to Brooklyn, and also is able to moving from different places to place to be able to sustain themselves and then find a different life. Marisol is bitter about moving and doing different things in terms of things that she doesn't want to be under her mother's wing anymore, and she wants to do her own thing. Frequently thinks about killing her mother in terms and also taking on her skin, which that's a creepy thing to be able to read about. And basically that reference gets made multiple times through the narrative, and you also sense that Marisol was not happy in terms of the life that she had been living up to that point. Lo and behold, there is a fateful encounter in terms of Marisol where she ends up being knocked down by a guy, like swearing vengeance against that respective guy for things, which leads to her meeting 17-year-old Genevieve. And Genevieve, when she is introduced, you follow her because she's going through her own respective issues for things. When you meet Genevieve, she is the only biracial girl that is living in her family. Her father is white, her stepmother is white, and also her step siblings are baby twins who are white as well. So she is the only biracial member of the household, and she struggles a little bit with that in terms of things, in terms of not knowing who her black birth mother was. She is a light-skinned girl, like long spiraling hair. She has skin condition which she struggles with, where she feels like her skin is burning. It's kind of like an eczema type thing. And one of the things that I will give credit to Skin for doing with respect to telling Genevieve's stories is that I did find that Genevieve's perspective in terms of her respective struggles with chronic skin issues was realistic. That was probably one of the more compelling parts of Skin that I was like, okay, this is presented well, at least in this part of the story. And she talks about her skin burning. And she tries various creams, but it brings her very little relief in terms of the struggles that she has. Things start changing when Genevieve suddenly starts experiencing different things that make her question there's more to her skin issues than she thinks. And she tries to find relief in terms of anything that she can have, like, for things. But one fateful instance where she is holding one of the twins, where the twin is a harrowing a state for things, and it causes an emergency. She realizes she says she thinks that she might be something more than meets the eye. She's afraid to ask questions because she doesn't know what she is, and she doesn't know, like, in terms of how, like, what's going on in terms of things. Genevieve and Marisol actually meet. It's because Marisol's mother is employed as a caretaker for the twins, as well as Genevieve, in terms of doing household work and stuff like that. And so Marisol's mother and Marisol herself end up living with Genevieve's family in terms of things. But then you realize that the relationship between Marisol and Genevieve is a lot more than a lot of racial trauma that reveal as the narrative goes on in terms of the context. So you can tell that both Marisol as well as Genevieve are both Sokoya, and Genevieve does not have that background, but yet Marisol does. And there's a distinct difference between the girls in terms of where Marisol has dark skin, shorter hair, curly hair, and she does not really find her appearance to be ideal. Whereas when she meets Genevieve, she finds her to be very pretty and essentially like, you know, like taking like compliments in terms of her lighter skin and everything else. And then Genevieve's perspective has her looking at Marisol and thinking about all the ways that Marisol can be beautified up in terms of things like her short hair, like criticizing her short hair, criticizing like certain aspects about Marisol, which is very odd, and that plays into the colorism like that is presented in this respective novel, and it gets worse as it goes on. But you can sense that there's animosity between both Genevieve and Marisol in terms of things, even though they are connected and they are of the same kin in terms of the abilities that they have and like the relationship between their families and the connection that they share. Like from that, it's rooted in quite a bit of trauma, very much an obsession in terms of the girls trying to find ways to make themselves pretty and deal with their respective identities as Sokoya. And the other aspect of this novel is the relationships that both Marisol and Genevieve have outside of the family as well. You realize that Genevieve has a boyfriend named Micah who does not treat her very well. And essentially Marisol knows this in terms of things and has plenty to say about it. And then you also see that Marisol meets a boy, a Jab named Jaden, who she does not want to get involved with because she notes that he is a devil, he is evil, she doesn't want to get involved with him, but yet she's intrigued by him and he's intrigued by her, and they have various run-ins in terms of things. So that's a summation of kind of like where the narrative is going in terms of things. Where it ends is where I definitely felt like I wanted to throw the book across the room. If it wasn't virtual, I probably would have mentally thrown this book across the room in terms of how it chose to end things, and essentially played up a lot of the colorism issues. Again, as I mentioned before, Caribbean culture is not a monolith. Does representation of specific lore in terms of things, especially like if this is representing Haiti, felt like it was conflating different things. And even from the representation of Jaden's character, who is a Jab, many people may not know what Jab is from this respective novel, which is something that bugged me, because as it is presented in this novel, you would think Jab is evil, and that is not the case. That is not the case at all. Jab essentially is derived from the French term, which literally means devil, but it's not the reason for that a lot of people think about it. The carnival reference that is made in terms of Jane's character and his character as the Jab, like it makes reference to actually a ceremony that happens where folks who are across the different Caribbean islands have different rituals where they paint their bodies with motor oil or paint that's dark, and they wear helmets with horns. I'll put up a picture up for your reference in terms of what that looks like. They wear chains and the like, and it's rooted in cultural nods to the resistance against ancestral oppression that happened on the islands when the ancestors were enslaved. So it is an ode. It is actually a tribute in terms of where different islands have different celebrations for being able to give nods to their ancestors in terms of things. So it's not necessarily a devil thing or a devil magic thing. Like I want to stress that, because someone picking this up and who may be from the culture may be very offended from that in terms of the presentation of Jab and the way that it's done in here, because there's a lot of cultural context to it that needed to be handled with more sensitivity than it was. And to kind of like make a note of it, the Jab or the Jab like celebrations have different names across the different islands. In Haiti specifically, I think it is called Lancet Claude, and in Trinidad it's called Jouvert, if I remember correctly from the French term. But it has different names, it has different aspects to it that I feel like were very underutilized and not explained within the narrative at all in terms of giving the cultural context. So when talking about the world building, talking about the lore building, this book did very threadbare presentation in terms of the lore in this respective work, and that was something that bothered me because it can be misinterpreted and actually can cause harm in terms of people thinking of one thing about it in terms of things. But to talk about Jaden's character specifically in terms of his portrayal as a Jab Jab and what he's able to do in the novel, he was the most interesting character in this book to me, in terms of things, because of what he's able to do and the magic that he is able to wield in terms of things and the role that he plays. Because the other girls are very self-centered and Jaden just comes in and he's like, y'all can't do that. I didn't like certain parts of Jaden's character, but it was interesting that he was able to stuff a soul inside a cat, even though the effect was temporary. That was kind of a cool aspect that kind of came towards the latter part of the novel. I won't spoil it in terms of the context of it, but it was really cool to be able to see. And I was like, okay, I want to know more about this character. He was the most interesting character in this novel, and I wanted to be able to see more of him. The girls, Genevieve and Marisol, they are not great characters to follow. In short summary, I really just did not like Marisol or Genevieve's characters very much. It was very toxic to be in their heads for prolonged periods of time because of how bitter they were. And I understand that this is a narrative that is very, very dark. All the characters are flawed in some way. All the characters are flawed in some way. And I know this is a YA fantasy. There were parts of this that could have possibly lent itself to YA horror, I would almost even say, but the horror was not done very well apart from a few harrowing scenes. The twins being in Pearl. The twins were definitely in Pearl quite a number of times. People confronting Marisol in terms of what she is and learning about her, like the tension for that was done succinctly. But being in Marisol and Genevieve's head in terms of the toxicity that they have in their mind about themselves, about their relationships and things like that, it got exhausting very quickly in terms of things. And I'm like, do y'all girls you have this magic in terms of things, do y'all really it's played up as this thing that they desire in terms of like the abilities that they have in the obsession of wanting to make themselves beautiful, but it was very gross in the context of how it was done in this respective novel. And it was not lost on me in terms of how one of the books that Marisol loved was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And essentially, like, if you have read The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, you know about the issues in terms of the way that presents colorism, self-hate in terms of things. And it does it in a very distinct way in terms of the young girl protagonist. And I've talked about The Bluest Eye on my channel before. I've reviewed it. I've talked about it in terms of things. Like, I'll link that cards above in the description down below if you're interested in seeing that review. The way that The Bluest Eye was referenced, first it was subtle and then it was overt. Very clear that both of the girls have self-esteem, self-hate issues in terms of things, and they want to be more idealized in terms of wanting to be a part of this ideal type life that they want to live in terms of things, and not being comfortable in their own skins. More developed narrative, you would think that would probably be a profound thing to discover in terms of seeing parallels of not being comfortable in the skin you're in, and then working that insecurity out. But in this, it's like both of these girls have self-hate towards the skins that they're in, and it has nothing to do with the fact that they're sokoya. It's the fact that they're black girls and they want to they want to make themselves different in terms of things, and it's rooted in colorism and colonialization. If Zoboi wanted to make a statement in terms of things. It was absolutely the wrong one for this respective work, because I'm like, how do you have these two girls, especially with how this book ends, and I'm not going to spoil the ending in terms of things, but it's like, it very much feels like dark, it gives the message of dark skin is bad and lighter skin is good, and I did not like that respective message towards the end of the novel in terms of the way that was handled. And it's frustrating in terms of things, because this could have been so such a more interesting novel if it did not lend to harmful stereotypes and colorism in terms of things. I just that had me heated towards the end of the novel, and I just felt like I wanted to throw the book across the room in terms of how that was done. So I was just like, I can't get behind this respective book in terms of what it chose to do. And yeah, I did not like that aspect. And the way that it handles certain fates of certain characters, and essentially goes to the plot point I just mentioned, it really rushes that ending in terms of things, and it feels not just incomplete but unsatisfying in terms of how it chooses to march toward. And it felt like a waste of lore. It felt like a waste of lore in terms of things, and it could have been so much more interesting. It was very frustrating to read, and actually very hurtful to read. There's a reference that in terms of one part of the book where Beyonce's song "Pretty Hurts" is referenced. And I had said in my review, this book had none of the pretty and all of the hurt in terms of things, and it hurt to read. Self-identity hate, and essentially that being played up by the events of the novel. I did not like that aspect at all. Something else I wanted to mention in terms of the terminology for the sokoya, as well as the reference made that in terms of how it is treated in the narrative. Granted, I've looked at several different videos and several different ways of the lore with respect to the sokoya in terms of how it was portrayed, but none of the terms are explained in text in terms of being able to make the distinction of what this being is and why it's terrifying, and the history of why it is terrifying in terms of things. It really pared down, blended portrayal of this character, which should be way more fascinating than what it is. But because of the way that Skin is written and the way these portrayals are done, it prompts a lot of questions. And I noted that the terms are mentioned, but they are not exactly explained. The sokoya is mentioned, but also the lugaro is mentioned. But if you look at the terminology for lugaro, and I'll put the spelling up for your reference in terms of things where it's specific to Haiti, that actually means werewolf. If you look at the terminology from Haiti specifically, it's very different from what the fire witch portrayal is in terms of things. And I think many people may not understand that the way that the terms are in terms of things means that this is a character that shapeshifts in the night and takes on different forms. Usually it is an older woman who is able to shapeshift, and there are certain aspects of that in terms of things where it makes it many people will not get that reference from either the terminology in terms of things. And the mention that I had before earlier in this video about Shin Megami Tensei 5 in terms of the reference to the lugaro, there is a character in Shin Megami Tensei 5 in which, this is not a spoiler, it's just one part of the game in terms of things. The protagonist is in this other world in terms of things where they encounter the lugaro, which I'll put a picture up for your reference, and you can tell it looks like a werewolf, where the lugaro has kidnapped several students in terms of things, and it gives this very detailed, interesting, very vibrant portrayal of a character and their respective motivations, and is actually quite close to the actual lore. And I'll put I'll put a link to where the description of that respective character is with respect to Shin Megami Tensei in the description down below for your reference if you're interested in seeing the lore of that. But I've been told by multiple people that the Lugaro as portrayed in Shin Megami Tensei 5 and Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance was very accurate to the lore in terms of things, and I thought it did a phenomenal job. I think there is also a representation of the Sokoya in another game. I want to say that it was Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne, but I have not been able to find the character in terms of things. And the thing that I like about the Shin Megami Tensei series, collectively speaking, is that it does such a great job of being able to examine different folklore, different mythologies from different places, in addition to Japanese mythology and folklore and in terms of things, and does so in a respectful way. I did not like the fact that Skin did not do this in a respectful way and actually associated a very interesting piece of folklore from the Caribbean, specifically from multiple islands in the Caribbean, and did so in just a lackluster way. It was not portrayed to, I think, the level that it should have been in to be compelling and interesting, and not see two specific stereotypes, and to loop this folklore, whether it's talking about the Sokoya or the Lugaro or Jab Jab even, to reduce that down to a harmful portrayal of two girls who are insecure about their respective skin tones, to display this harmful colorism, was a very reductive way of portraying a story, and I thought that was not the direction to go into. So that is something that really frustrated me about Skin, and I think it's probably best for me to leave it there in terms of how my frustrations with this novel, because we could go all day, all night in terms of talking about how much this novel disappointed me. Gave it overall 1.5 out of 5 stars. There were interesting pieces of Skin by Ibi Zoboi that I think, in a better narrative, given room to develop and not just lend into a stereotypical presentation, I think it could have been a better story. But the story as presented, and with the elements and the specific intentions in terms of what it chose to do, it didn't work. It didn't work, and I was so disappointed by it. It could have been so much more in terms of a story, and I hope to actually be able to look at more stories where I can learn more about the lore in terms of in terms of where it's portrayed more respectfully, and also in a story that's more intriguing. But that is my review of Skin by Ibi Zoboi. I gave it 1.5 out of 5 stars. I like the quicker I forget this book, the better. It was very disappointing, to say the least, and it hurt in a lot of ways in terms of being able to read that and just feel like, you know, it could have been so much better in terms of a potential story. So that is my rant, my spiel, leaving it there. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell to be informed of when I post new videos. Thank you again so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next video.